There is no question climate change is a global challenge that affects everybody, but the impact hasn't been equal. Certain populations are at higher risk because of race, gender, age, disability, and income inequalities. And while we're all weathering the same storm, we don't have the same resources. Verizon believes technology and networks can play a role in helping communities survive and thrive as the climate changes. And if done thoughtfully, technology can be a part of advancing climate justice. Technology can be a bridge to help communities become more resilient to the acute and ongoing impact from climate change. The more resilient a society we create, the more just the society has the potential to be. Verizon recently announced the launch of its Forward for Good Accelerator. It's a multi-year initiative that aims to advance cutting-edge technology solutions that address some of the most critical societal challenges. It's starting by helping communities build resilience and thrive as the climate changes, with a special focus on advancing climate justice for populations who bear the impacts of climate change disproportionately. Next 20 is Verizon's series where we examine the issues that will shape the next 20 years. And for our conversation about climate justice today, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Ayana Johnson. Dr. Johnson is the co-founder of Urban Ocean Lab. She's also the co-founder of the All We Can Save project, and of course the co-host of the podcast I listen to often, How to Save a Planet. Dr. Johnson, it's great to talk to you today. I'd love to get into the specifics of climate justice, but I want to start with some background for you because you are a marine biologist. You have authored the Blue New Deal, sort of looking at a roadmap to include ocean in the broader climate goal here. How much of your day job has informed your view on climate change here and the focus with which you take on the issue?
So as a marine biologist, by training, I came to climate issues through the lens of ocean conservation. When we think about what is happening to the ocean and how integral it is to our climate system, I realized I needed to broaden the scope of my work. And it was actually a particular moment. I spent almost a decade working with Caribbean island communities and local governments to try to help innovate and transform policies to make fishing more sustainable, to help establish marine protected areas. And I've been working on the island of Barbuda for a few years when Hurricane Irma hit the island. And as you said, these extreme weather events are not affecting everyone equally. And that island lost power, lost all communications for like 2 days. No one knew if anyone on the island was okay, the 2,000 or so people who lived there. And having worked there for 2 years on how do we make sure fishing is managed perfectly, and talking with fishermen and talking with local government and community leaders, and then realizing that if they had the perfect ocean policy, they could still be hit by an extremely strong hurricane, strengthened by climate change, that they did very little to cause or aggravate. And that because of, colonial history and the context there, they would have, as you described, a hard time recovering and being as resilient as other communities. And that was, I think, a very big inflection point for me in my work, realizing that ocean conservation and all of that local work is critical, but that I could also be useful in helping to connect the dots. You mentioned the Blue New Deal, which I helped to co-create, making sure that the ocean is part of how we think about climate policy.
And that's brought you to this unique intersection that you look into, which is racial justice and climate as well. We said up top here that climate change affects us differently. And when you talk about climate justice, how should we be thinking about who is most at risk and why?
The people who are most at risk from, say, extreme weather events, whether those are floods or droughts or wildfires or hurricanes, are the people who are already the most disadvantaged, are the people who have the fewest resources and flexibility and opportunity to think about what their life looks like post-disaster, right? When we think about even Hurricane Katrina hitting New Orleans, who had a car and could just leave, and who could not get out? Who had the resources to move or to rebuild and who did not? And it's important to realize that all of these climate impacts are hitting a society that is already fractured in all these different ways across all of these different aspects that you described: race and class and gender and ability and age and all of this. And so extreme weather events hit society as it exists, and it exists in very unequal ways right now. And so the way that, in fact, the US military describes climate change is that it's a threat multiplier. It just makes all vulnerabilities more vulnerable, right? It makes all risks riskier. And I think it's important to just remember that climate change is the context for everything, and that all these other layers are sort of additive.
So how do you tackle the issue as somebody who is informed in the science, but also the inequity that exists?
Yeah. Well, I realize that I can't solve climate change alone. So step one is to think about, how can I personally be most useful? And with my background as a marine scientist, and then also working in policy, in the Caribbean, in the US federal government, and being a girl who grew up in Brooklyn, who's obsessed with design as the daughter of an architect and a teacher, and really thinking about the communication piece of this too. All of those things come together when we think about the future of coastal cities. And it's so easy to brush off that whole body of work as like something for the coastal elite. But it's very important to remember that about 1 in 3 Americans live in a coastal city. This is a huge portion of the nation's population that's at risk from rising seas and storms and heat waves and all of these ways climate change is hitting our metropolises. And so Urban Ocean Lab is the think tank that I co-founded that's focused on policy for the future of coastal cities. And so that is one of the ways in which I'm contributing to the huge amount of work that needs to be done by figuring out what is the nexus of skills and interests that I can bring to the table.
You talked about coastal cities. Certainly that's been a big focus, not just in the US, but globally, because of the threats that we're already seeing. We've heard stories of places in Miami, for example, where we've seen the sea levels rise significantly, development moving into areas that were traditionally set aside for the underserved. What stood out to you when you look at the coastal cities in the US and the impact we're already seeing from climate change?
One of the things that stands out to me is the denial, the sort of insistence on rebuilding in exactly the same places, knowing that without a doubt they're going to be hit again by a storm, that sea level rise is not going to stop, right? We've already baked too much heat into this system. And so I think for me, the real challenge is figuring out, what does it look like to make this transition and actually just respect nature and our changed climate enough to sort of start to move away from these most vulnerable areas, to help people who want to move out of harm's way. And the term that is most often used for that is managed retreat. I know retreat is like a very un-American concept, right? We want to like battle, we're going to like build the walls and the sea walls, and we're going to like hold back the entire ocean. But even in New York City, there's 570 something miles of coastline. We cannot fortify our entire coastline. There is not enough money and concrete in the world. So what does it look like to live in a way that respects the fact that nature is changing around us? I think is a question that we need to face much more head on. And there are lots of different ways to adapt, but it will be certainly critical to keep justice at the core of that transition, right? To make sure that the same people who always get left behind don't get left behind this time.
What do you tell policymakers who are looking at this holistically to say what that justice element should look like and how they need to tackle that issue head on in the context of climate?
There's three things I find myself saying a lot. The first is, don't forget about the ocean. Because so often when we hear about climate policy, we do not hear anything about the ocean. We don't acknowledge the fact that the ocean has absorbed a third of the carbon dioxide we've emitted by burning fossil fuels, that it's absorbed over 90% of the heat that we've trapped with all these greenhouse gases, that it plays a major role in the climate system, and that the ocean is not just a victim of the impacts of climate change, but it's also a hero, right? Not just in the sense of buffering and stabilizing our climate system, but also in the sense that renewable offshore energy, like offshore wind and wave and solar energy, can be a big part of how we power coastal communities. That regenerative farming of seaweed and shellfish in the ocean can be one of the most low impact, low carbon footprint sources of nutrition. That restoring coastal ecosystems like wetlands and mangroves and seagrasses, those are ecosystems that absorb several times more carbon than a forest on land. So they should get some attention too, right? And the Blue New Deal that I helped to craft was really just laying out these opportunities, these climate solutions that the ocean is offering, and saying, let's make sure to include these when we think about climate policy. So, the first thing I say is like, don't forget about the ocean, and like, here's some ideas of what that might look like. And in the same sort of mindset, it's don't forget about the full spectrum of leaders that we'll need to make all of these solutions possible, right? We need leaders in every community. We need a transformation of our economy and society, not just electricity, but transportation and agriculture and land use and manufacturing, right? All this has to shift. And so if we do not deliberately include people of color, include women, include people of all ages and cultures, and abilities and, intellectual backgrounds, then we will simply not have enough ideas at the table, and we will not have enough people to lead this transition. And I just think of it as like, what a missed opportunity if we're not bringing sort of all the best ideas to the table. So all the biases that exist in our society are holding us back in a lot of ways, obviously, but also in the context of addressing the climate crisis. And the third thing I say is just, we've got to do it way faster. So what do you need to really accelerate this policy change and implementation?
Is there a city or community you can point to right now that you think is really successfully navigating all of those layers you just pointed to, and that could potentially be a template?
Yeah, I think there's like bits and pieces happening everywhere, right? Like no one place is perfect. And in that framework, that really exemplifies the work that I've been doing with Dr. Catherine Wilkinson, with whom I co-edited this anthology, All We Can Save, which highlights a spectrum of 41 women who are doing leading work on climate from all of these different angles, from agriculture to the arts and science and policy and activism and journalism. There are so many different ways to be a part of this work, and there are so many climate solutions that we already have at our fingertips, right? We don't actually need to wait for like new technology or like something else. We can charge ahead with all of this stuff right now. And so this anthology is really an opportunity to look at the cornucopia of ways to be a part of solutions, of the work that's already happening, and how we might help that continue to unfurl, and how we might sort of like learn more from the wisdom of these wise women who are leading the way. But we know that women are often sort of underfunded in climate work. Quantitatively, we know this. This is not just a guess. Women of color are particularly underfunded, and just not listened to in terms of all of the wisdom that they're bringing to the table. And so it sounds sort of really simple, but if we want to win at addressing the climate crisis, we're going to need all the best ideas, all of the most passionate and effective leaders. And so everything we can do to eliminate biases in our society along race, class, gender, ability, all of it. That's what's going to help us succeed in the climate movement is the same thing that will help us succeed as a society.
To that point you just made about the focus in your anthology, though, can you speak a bit more about the role of women being central to this challenge?
Yeah. What we've learned, according to some sociological research, is that when women have more seats in parliament, for example, those parliaments pass stronger environmental laws. They enforce them more strongly. When women have more decision-making authority, more natural areas are protected. Women were leaders in the UN climate negotiations that created the Paris Agreement, right? Quantitatively, we know that when women have an equal seat at the table, the outcomes for the planet are better. So it's really important to make sure that we are actively seeking this gender equality in the work.
What do you attribute that to? When we talk about women being
sexism, I wish there were like a more complicated answer. It's just
but I mean, when we talk about
funding, who gets, to speak in contexts like this, it's sort of a reflection of society as it exists.
But when we talk about women sort of putting climate front and center, you talked about if women are in these positions of leadership, they do have the ability to tackle it in a more forceful way. What do you attribute that to?
That there are women doing this work?
Well, the prioritization of that.
I think it's very easy to sort of like fall into gender stereotypes of like women being caretakers and more nurturing, but we know that a lot of the, those stereotypical gender roles are a reflection of how people are raised in our society and not, completely just innate differences in gender. So I do want to be a little bit careful there, but I will say that we've certainly seen women approaching climate work in a way that weaves together head and heart in really beautiful ways, that acknowledges that the climate crisis has a lot of like emotional layers to it too, right? Like it's big and overwhelming, and it's a lot to sort of even get your head around that we've changed the chemistry of our atmosphere and our ocean. And there's a lot of focus that we see among women leading on climate that is focused on the collective, that's focused on community building, that's focused on welcoming people in and helping people find their roles and how they can best fit. And of course, anyone of any gender can approach problem solving with that mindset. So it's not exclusive to women. It's just something that we've seen women sort of showing up in droves to do. And the most visible example of that has been the youth climate movement. When we think about the young women leading climate strikes around the world, it is mostly women who have started that movement, who saw Greta Thunberg in Sweden and were not like, that looks weird. Why is she protesting outside of Swedish parliament by herself? But said, oh, I'm going to do that in my town, right? Because no one would have heard of Greta if she were still sitting there by herself, but that you had these teenage girls all over the world who created a global trend of climate activism. And as time has gone by in that movement, there have been more boys that have joined, but I think it's just been remarkable to watch that that next generation of feminine leadership emerge and sort of shake us older folks and say, like, you gotta do better. Like, you are gambling away our futures, and like, we really need more from you grown-ups. And the moral clarity that these young folks are bringing is absolutely critical when, we get so used to having to compromise all the time that we forget there are some things that you just can't compromise on. You can't like negotiate with the physics of climate change. It just is what it is, and it requires really major changes that it requires.
Talked a lot about the need to remove barriers and accelerate implementation, take solutions to scale, that you can't necessarily rely on technology. But I wonder where you see technology fitting into tackling the issue. What are some areas where you think tech can be a big boost to try and accelerate the movement?
Tech is absolutely a critical tool in this work, right? And I think of it as a tool, right? We need so many different tools there. And I often sort of conflate technology and engineering, right? Because when it comes to climate solutions, they often go together. When we think about how we need to modernize our entire electricity grid, there's, engineering and infrastructure pieces of that, as well as technology pieces of that. When we think about energy efficiency, there's certainly technological elements there. We have, tech companies with large data centers trying to figure out how to make them more energy efficient and using technology to do a modeling that would enable that kind of thing. We certainly, in the wake of all of these increasingly unnatural disasters, are seeing the need to simply be able to stay connected for safety, to be able to find your loved ones and get to where you need to go, where you can be safe again. And that connectivity in terms of tech is really important too. So I like to think of technology as a tool as opposed to like the solution, because so often we're tempted to think that technology will solve this problem, right? That like we will just invent our way out of the climate crisis, when in reality what's needed is also a cultural transformation, the building of political will, and really thinking about nature as the foundation, right? Thinking about photosynthesis and protecting and restoring natural areas as a significant contribution to how we can bring carbon cycles back into balance.
So let's talk about the theme of this series, which is Next 20. There's a lot of people who are out there looking at this issue saying, I want to be able to do something. It's the individual action that leads to collective action. What do you tell those people who say, what can I as one individual do about this issue?
I get asked this question a lot, and I'm always glad, because it is so important that everybody is able to find and answer that question, and that we move beyond the sort of checklist that's the same for everyone that the climate movement has sort of been offering a lot of people to date, right? You've got to vote, you've got to march, you've got to donate, you've got to spread the word, you have to like reduce your own carbon footprint, and absolutely do those things. I do those things, right? But we also have to figure out how people can bring their superpowers to the table, right? If I was doing the same thing as everyone else, that would be a missed opportunity. So the thing that I ask people to consider is to consider this a little bit like an arts project, right? Bust out your colored pencils and draw a Venn diagram with 3 overlapping circles. And in the first circle, jot down some ideas for what skills do you have? What are you good at? What can you bring to the table in terms of areas of expertise or resources? And in the second circle, jot down some ideas on like, which are the climate solutions you're most excited to work on, right? There's so many things to choose from. Do you want to be a part of, getting composting happening in your city, or more bike lanes, or accelerating policy for renewable energy, or making sure that we have more coverage of climate in the mainstream media, because it's so rare on the nightly news that we're even really hearing about this. So, sort of like, what piece of the puzzle do you want to work on? And then the third is, what brings you joy? Like, what gets you up in the morning? What are the things that you can take delight in? Because this is the work of our lifetimes, right? There's no reason to pick a thing to contribute to that will make you miserable. So draw those 3 things. What are you good at? which part of it do you want to do and what brings you joy? And then find your way to the center of that. And it doesn't have to be your full-time job. It can be volunteer work. It can be the way you show up with your family, your town, your sports team, your church, your school, right? Thinking in these broadening circles beyond yourself as an individual, and moving from the what can I do to the what can we do, and like finding who are the people that you want to collaborate with in making these shifts. Because, you know, I mean, it sounds cheesy, but it's true. Like, we're just stronger together and no one can do it alone.
What can companies do to tackle this issue? We've seen a lot of activism from individuals, but what about companies like Verizon? What should Verizon do?
I'm so glad to be asked this question because I think there's so much opportunity there, right? There is an opportunity to show that a completely different way of doing business is possible, that puts first, people and planet over profits, even in some scenarios, because there are no profits on a dead planet, right? So thinking more in the longer term as far as how to balance the different business interests, I think is key. Thinking about not just quarterly profits, but where the company would be in the next 20 years and how that is utterly dependent on how we address the climate crisis. And so really committing to lead your industry, right? In each sector, we need leaders who are showing other corporations in their sector what is possible, who are raising the bar. And I think that something that we don't give enough credit to is how important it is to tell the story of how that work is unfolding so that others can be inspired by it and even sort of like humbled by the trial and error that it necessarily takes, right? Like, no one knows exactly precisely how to do this right because we've just never done it before. And of course, we have like great science and smart minds in all these companies and experts who can advise. But I think it's so important to talk about that trajectory and the trial and error so that others can sort of avoid your mistakes, repeat your successes, and that we can maybe just like tamp down the competition a little bit and think about how to raise the sort of like efforts and bar in each sector. But I mean, on a very tangible level, right? Every corporation, just like every household, eventually like needs to figure out how to get their emissions to zero, and then to start drawing down and sequestering greenhouse gases as part of their operations. And the last thing I'll say here is that of course, on that, the sooner the better, right? Setting that goal for like 2100 is basically meaningless. So thinking about, how can we do that within 5 or 10 years is the time frame that we need to be thinking in. And the last opportunity is that corporations, we've seen a lot of examples of this lately, have a really strong political voice. That when corporations talk to policymakers, talk to Congress and say, like, we are trying our best to address the climate crisis, like, here's what we need from you as far as a policy framework. That is really powerful because the people, the corporate, lobbyists who most often are speaking to politicians are the ones who say, like, don't regulate us. We don't want it. We want to like keep burning things and like, don't force us into this future where we focus on climate solutions or slow down. But corporations that say like, no, actually go faster. We're ready. Like, that is transformational when corporations can lead that boldly and say, like, well, this is our corporate plan. We know our sector can reach this bar because we're already committed to it. Like, let's make sure the policy is keeping up.
Last question. I'm curious what that Venn diagram looks like for you, especially that last piece you talked about.
The joy piece. That's really hard. And I think, the first answer to the Venn diagram is Urban Ocean Lab, right? I was sort of describing that when I was telling you how that came to be, like the academic and professional training that I've had around ocean science and policy, and climate, and then sort of the like being committed to figuring out solutions for coastal cities, having that passion from where I'm from. And then I just love design. And this in coastal cities is like a design problem. I'm the daughter of an architect. Like I've been trained to see the world as a design challenge, and really thinking about like how do we make this work beautiful? Because so often the work of think tanks or nonprofits is just like very functional, as opposed to how do we make this like beautiful and welcoming and exciting. And I'm just a huge dork, so I actually really like writing policy memos. So my Venn diagram, again, like not the same as everybody else's. And so that's one answer, but I think we can also have different ones, right? Like for the All We Can Save project, I am like a huge nerd for writing and editing. And I love like helping to craft pieces that really like cut through the noise and get to the point and help people see things in a different way. So co-editing that anthology with Catherine Wilkinson was really such a joy. And then thinking about the work that needs doing in terms of gender equality so we can like unfurl the true potential of humanity on solving these challenges. And then I find collaborations really joyful. I find the way that a lot of women are showing up to participate in this work like really elegant and collective. And I guess I think we can each have multiple Venn diagrams, but those are two of mine.
Dr. Ayanna Johnson, we really appreciate you joining for this next 20 episode. It has been great to talk to you. Appreciate your time.
Likewise, my absolute pleasure.